The first time I stepped into my grandfather's house after his passing, I felt like a stranger. At 58, I thought I'd known everything about him, his stories from the war, his collection of rare coins, and his peculiar habit of keeping every National Geographic magazine since 1965. But standing there, surrounded by the silence that had replaced his hearty laugh, I realized how little I truly knew. The call had come 3 days earlier. Grandpa George, at 92, had peacefully passed in his sleep. As his only living relative, my parents long gone, no siblings, my marriage dissolved after Sarah left 15 years ago, the responsibility of handling his estate fell to me. I'd taken time off from the hardware store I'd managed for nearly 30 years to sort through his affairs. "Mr. Harrison, everything appears to be in order," Mrs. Abernathy, his attorney, had said that morning. A small, efficient woman with glasses that constantly slipped down her nose, she handed me a folder containing his will and various legal documents. "Your grandfather was meticulous about his affairs. The house is yours, along with all contents and his accounts." I nodded, still processing. Grandpa George had lived in the same two-story colonial in Worcester, Massachusetts, since before I was born. The thought of selling it felt like betrayal, yet keeping it seemed impractical when my modest apartment in Boston had been home for decades. "There's just one thing," Mrs. Abernathy added, pushing her glasses up. "He left this for you." She handed me an envelope with my name written in his shaky handwriting. I opened it after she left. Inside was a single key and a note: "Jacob, some legacies are heavier than others. In the basement, behind the old furnace. Your decision now. With love, Grandpa." That's what brought me to the basement that evening, flashlight in hand, navigating around the ancient furnace that had heated the house since the 1960s. The space behind it had always been Grandpa's domain, off-limits even during childhood hide-and-seek games. I'd never questioned it. Moving boxes of Christmas decorations and old tools, I discovered what the key was for: a wall safe, expertly concealed behind a false panel. I'd visited this house hundreds of times and never known it existed. The key slid in perfectly. With a deep breath, I turned it and pulled the heavy door open. What I found inside would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family. First, there were stacks of cash, old bills, meticulously bundled. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands of dollars. My hands trembled as I set them aside. Next came documents in faded manila folders, property deeds, stock certificates dating back to the 1950s, and papers in languages I couldn't read. But it was the leather-bound journal beneath everything that changed everything. The journal was thick, the pages yellowed with age, filled with my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Opening to the first page, I read, "August 12, 1946. I've decided to record everything, should the truth ever need to be known. What follows is the complete account of my life, not George Harrison of Worcester, Massachusetts, but George Heinemann of Munich, Germany. My grandfather wasn't who I thought he was." I sank to the cold concrete floor, journal in hand, and began reading a story that spanned continents and decades, a story of a young German soldier who had made terrible choices, witnessed unspeakable things, and ultimately fled his homeland with secrets and stolen wealth. As night deepened around the old house, I lost myself in the confessions of a man I'd loved but never truly known. The grandfather who had taught me to fish, who had attended every baseball game and school play, who had held me when my parents died in that car accident when I was 12, he had been someone else entirely before becoming the man I knew. "I've built my American life on blood money," he wrote in one passage. "Every comfort purchased with what I took from those who would never return to claim it. I've given to charities, established anonymous scholarships, tried to balance the cosmic scales, but some debts can never be repaid." By dawn, I had read it all, the full confession of a man who had served as a guard at Dachau, who had stolen from the dead, who had escaped to America using false papers when the right collapsed, who had changed his identity and lived in fear of discovery for decades, all while building a quiet, respectable life, who had raised me with love and wisdom. I closed the journal as sunlight began filtering through the small basement windows. My hands were numb, my mind racing. In the safe, beneath where the journal had been, lay a final envelope. Inside was a list of names and organizations, with specific amounts next to each. At the top, a note: Jacob, if you're reading this, I am gone. This is my attempt at atonement. The money is tainted, but perhaps it can do some good. Your choice. The list included Jewish organizations, Holocaust museums, and charities dedicated to war refugees. Beside each was a sum that, combined, accounted for much more than the cash in the safe. My grandfather had been planning a posthumous confession and restitution. But he had left the decision to me. I trudged upstairs, exhausted and overwhelmed. Making coffee in his kitchen, surrounded by familiar photos, including one of him proudly standing next to me at my high school graduation, I felt the weight of his secret pressing down on me. The man in those pictures, the man who had shaped my life, was both the loving grandfather I remembered and something altogether darker. For 3 days, I barely left the house. I read the journal twice more, examined every document in the safe, and researched online what I could about my grandfather's true past. The evidence was compelling. George Heinemann had existed, had indeed been at Dachau, and had disappeared after the war. My grandfather had carried this secret for over 70 years. On the 4th day, I called in sick to the hardware store again and drove to the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I didn't know what I was looking for, perhaps understanding, perhaps a path forward. Walking through the solemn exhibits, seeing the faces of victims, reading accounts of survivors, I felt my grandfather's crimes in a way the journal couldn't convey. In the research center, a kind archivist helped me search records. Many of those who participated in these atrocities were never brought to justice, she explained gently, unaware of my personal connection to her words. Some lived entire lives without facing consequences. Is there a statute of limitations? I asked, my voice barely steady. For war crimes? No, she said, looking at me curiously. Is there something specific you're researching? I thanked her and left without answering. The drive back to Massachusetts gave me time to think, to weigh impossible choices. By the time I reached Grandpa's house, my house now, according to the will, I had made my decision. The next morning, I called Mrs. Abernathy. I need to transfer ownership of my grandfather's house and accounts to a trust, I explained. And I'd like your help with something else, something confidential. 2 weeks later, everything was arranged. The house would be sold, with proceeds going to the organizations on my grandfather's list. The substantial investments and accounts he'd accumulated, far more than I'd realized existed, would likewise be liquidated and distributed according to his wishes, with additional beneficiaries I had researched. But the journal and documents presented a more difficult choice. These could still bring charges, even posthumously, Mrs. Abernathy warned when I showed her what I'd found. It would tarnish his memory completely. And there could be complications for you, as the beneficiary of his estate. I nodded, understanding the implications. I've considered that. May I ask what you plan to do? She inquired, her professional demeanor softened by genuine concern. I looked at the journal in my hands. The truth deserves to be known, I said finally. But so does the full truth, including the man he became, the regret he carried, and the restitution he planned. The decision wasn't just about justice or family loyalty. It was about understanding that people could contain multitudes, terrible darkness and genuine goodness. The grandfather who had raised me with such care had also been a young man who made monstrous choices in another life. I spent the next month meticulously preparing. I organized the documents, translated the foreign papers, and created a comprehensive record. I wrote my own account, detailing the grandfather I had known, his kindness, his community involvement, his values, alongside the truth of his past. Then I contacted the Holocaust Museum again, this time with a specific purpose. I'd like to make a donation, I told the director during our meeting. Not just money, but historical documents and a first-hand account. When I explained what I had, her expression grew serious. This would be significant, she said. May I ask how you came by these materials? He was my grandfather, I answered simply. I only learned the truth after his death. The process that followed was more complicated than I'd anticipated. Historians authenticated the documents. Investigators from various agencies interviewed me repeatedly. The media caught wind of the story. Nazigard lived quiet life in Massachusetts, and suddenly reporters were at my door, neighbors were calling, and the hardware store owner suggested I take an extended leave. The public reaction was what you'd expect: outrage that he had escaped justice, debates about whether his later life of apparent decency mattered, speculation about how much I had known before his death. I received both hate mail and messages of support, sometimes on the same day. Through it all, I tried to navigate a path that honored truth without erasing complexity. Yes, he had participated in terrible crimes. Yes, he had lived a lie. But he had also been the man who taught me integrity, who volunteered at the Veterans Hospital every Thursday for 40 years, who had left instructions to make what amends he could. 6 months after finding the safe, I stood in my empty apartment in Boston, packing the last of my belongings. The sale of Grandpa's house had finalized, the proceeds distributed. My resignation from the hardware store had been accepted. Nothing tied me to Massachusetts anymore. Too many reporters, too many whispers, too many memories now complicated by knowledge I couldn't unlearn. The small box on my coffee table contained the few items I'd kept from the safe: a photo of my grandfather as a young man in Germany, standing with who I presumed were his parents, a letter he'd written but never sent to someone named Elizabeth, and a small, worn wooden carving of a bird that had been tucked in the back of the safe. Everything else, the money, the documents, the journal, had been given away or donated to institutions that would preserve the historical record. The full truth, as best as it could be known, would be available for those who sought it. As I closed the door on my old life, I felt both burdened and freed by my grandfather's legacy. I had chosen truth over comfortable lies, consequences over concealment. But I had also chosen to remember the complexity of the man, both his crimes and his attempts at redemption. My new life waited across the country, a small town in Oregon where nobody knew my name or my family's history. A fresh start, funded by my own savings rather than my grandfather's tainted inheritance. As I drove away from Boston, a line from his journal kept returning to me: the hardest lesson I've learned is that a single life can contain both terrible wrong and genuine good. The second hardest is that atonement is never complete, only ongoing. Perhaps that was my inheritance after all, not money or property, but the understanding that redemption is a process without end, and that facing the truth, however painful, is the only path forward. The safe had contained dark secrets, yes. But it had also contained a choice, and in making mine, I found a kind of peace I hadn't known I was seeking. My grandfather's legacy lived on, both the darkness and the light. And so did mine. In Oregon, I bought a small house with a view of mountains. On my first night there, I unpacked the wooden bird carving and placed it on my mantel, a reminder of complicated truths and the weight of choices. Then I sat down at my desk and began to write my own story, beginning with the words. The first time I stepped into my grandfather's house after his passing, I felt like a stranger. The writing was therapeutic, each word a step toward processing what had happened. Months passed as I settled into my new community, finding work at a local bookstore and slowly making friends who knew nothing of my history. Then one day, a letter arrived with a Boston postmark. Inside was a faded photograph I'd never seen before: my grandfather in his 30s, standing beside a woman and a young boy. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, George, Samuel, and me, 1952. There was no note, no explanation, just a name and address in Florida. Her name was Ruth Silverman. She was 87 years old, living in a retirement community in Boca Raton. When I called the number listed in the phone book, her voice was strong and clear. "I wondered if you would contact me," she said. "I saw the stories in the news." "Who are you?" I asked. "How did you know my grandfather?" There was a long pause. "That's a complicated story," she finally replied. "One better told in person." 2 weeks later, I sat in Ruth's tidy apartment, surrounded by photos of children and grandchildren. She served tea in delicate cups and studied me with sharp eyes. "You look like him," she said finally. "Something around the eyes." Then she told me a story I never could have imagined. How my grandfather, newly arrived in America with his stolen wealth and false identity, had met her brother Samuel, a Holocaust survivor. How, through some twist of fate neither could have predicted, they had become business partners. How, eventually, George had confessed his true identity to Samuel. "My brother should have turned him in," Ruth said, her voice steady. "By all rights, he should have. But Samuel, he had seen so much death. He told George that justice without redemption was just more death." What followed was an account of an extraordinary pact between victim and perpetrator. Samuel had given George a choice: turn himself in, or dedicate his life and his stolen money to making amends. Together, they had established businesses that secretly employed refugees. They had created anonymous funds for survivors. And most incredibly, they had remained connected for decades. Samuel died in 1989, Ruth said, showing me photos of the two men together over the years. "Your grandfather continued their work after that. He never forgot his promise." "Why didn't you expose him?" I asked. "After everything he was part of?" Ruth considered this. "I wanted to, at first. But over time, I saw something I hadn't expected: genuine transformation. Not erasure of guilt, not forgetting, but change." She paused. "And Samuel believed that more good could come from his life than his imprisonment." Before I left, Ruth gave me a box of letters, correspondence between my grandfather and Samuel spanning nearly 40 years. Reading them in my hotel room that night, I discovered yet another layer to the man I thought I'd finally understood. The letters revealed struggles with guilt that never eased, moments of despair, and Samuel's unwavering insistence that George's atonement required living honestly with his past while working toward a better future. I returned to Oregon with the letters and a new perspective on my grandfather's legacy. The safe had contained only part of his truth. The full story was more complex, more human, and in some ways more troubling, because it forced me to consider difficult questions about justice, redemption, and whether someone who had participated in atrocity could ever truly make amends. Over the following year, I continued writing my account, now expanded to include Ruth's revelations and the letters between Samuel and my grandfather. The manuscript grew into something more than family history; it became an exploration of moral reckoning across generations. When I finally completed it, I sent copies to Ruth and to the Holocaust Museum, along with the letters. The curator who had worked with me on the original documents called after reading it. "This doesn't excuse what he did," she said carefully, "but it adds important complexity to the historical record. Would you consider having this published more widely?" I hesitated. "Would that help or harm the families of victims?" "Truth is rarely comfortable," she replied. "But it's necessary." The book was published 18 months later under the title The Safe: Inheritance of Guilt and Redemption. It received mixed reactions. Some praised its unflinching examination of moral complexity, others criticized it as too sympathetic to a man who had participated in genocide. I understood both perspectives. The journey from that night in the basement to becoming the author of this controversial memoir had transformed me too. I had lost the simple narrative of my beloved grandfather, but gained a deeper understanding of human capacity for both terrible wrong and genuine change. After a brief book tour, I returned to my quiet life in Oregon. The royalties went to Holocaust education programs, continuing what I now understood had been a lifelong mission of my grandfather's: not to erase his guilt, but to create some measure of good from his terrible past. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains in brilliant color, I received an email from a woman in Israel. She had read my book and recognized her father's name in one of the accounts. He had been helped by the fund my grandfather and Samuel had established for survivors starting new lives. "I don't forgive what your grandfather did," she wrote. "That isn't mine to give. But I wanted you to know that my father's life was made possible by what came after." Sometimes, the most human thing is to hold two contradictory truths at once. That night, I took the wooden bird carving from my mantel and examined it closely for the first time. Turning it over, I found tiny letters carved in the base, so small I needed a magnifying glass to read them. Reminder, both truths matter. Whether this had been a message to himself or eventually to me, I couldn't know. But I understood it now, in a way I couldn't have before opening that safe. Some legacies are indeed heavier than others. Some truths resist simple categorization. And sometimes, the most profound inheritance isn't answers, but questions we spend a lifetime trying to answer. The man who had been both George Heinemann and George Harrison, Nazi guard and loving grandfather, thief and benefactor, perpetrator and seeker of redemption, had left me not just the burden of his secrets, but the challenge of understanding that humans are rarely just one thing. We are capable of great evil and meaningful change, of causing harm and creating good, of being defined by our worst actions and yet not entirely reduced to them. That complexity doesn't erase responsibility or negate consequences. But it does invite us to consider what justice means across a lifetime, what redemption requires, and whether we have the courage to face difficult truths without retreating to comfortable simplicity. As for me, I continue to hold both versions of my grandfather in mind, the loving man who raised me and the young soldier who participated in atrocity. Both are true. Both matter. And in navigating that painful contradiction, I've found not absolution, but something perhaps more valuable, the understanding that our moral reckonings rarely end with neat conclusions, but continue across generations, demanding of us both honesty about the past and commitment to a more just future. The safe is empty now, its contents dispersed to those who can use them to educate, to remember, to prevent. But the questions it contained will remain with me always, a different kind of inheritance, and perhaps the most important one. 5 years passed. My quiet life in Oregon had become comfortable, almost predictable. The bookstore where I worked had promoted me to manager, and I'd found a community of friends who knew me only as Jacob, the thoughtful newcomer with a talent for recommending just the right book to each customer. The controversy surrounding my grandfather's story had largely faded from public memory, though occasionally a student would recognize my name when I gave talks at the local college about moral complexity and historical memory. Ruth had passed away peacefully 2 years ago, but not before introducing me to her extended family, who had, against all odds, welcomed me into their circle despite our complicated connection. Then came the letter that would open yet another chapter in this ongoing saga. It arrived on a Tuesday, official-looking with German postage. Inside was a formal communication from a restitution committee in Munich, explaining that additional assets belonging to George Heinemann had been identified during the digitization of old banking records. Apparently, before fleeing Germany, my grandfather had established accounts that had remained dormant for over 70 years. As the legal heir, you have claim to these assets, the letter explained. However, given the nature of their acquisition as detailed in your published account, the committee requests your input on appropriate disposition. Attached was a statement showing the original deposits, now worth over €3 million with accumulated interest. Money that had once belonged to those who never survived to reclaim it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Just when I thought I had resolved my grandfather's legacy, another piece of his past emerged, demanding another choice from me. I called the number provided and spoke with Dr. Bauer, the committee chair. We've established a precedent for such cases, she explained. The funds can be directed to restitution programs, memorial foundations, or descendant communities. I want no part of this money, I told her firmly. It should go to the families who lost everything. That's not always simple to determine, she replied. But there is something else you should know. Her voice softened. Among the records was a list. Names, carefully documented by your grandfather before he fled. We believe these may have been individuals he encountered. She promised to send the list, and when it arrived a week later, I spent days researching each name, combing through Holocaust archives and survivor registries. To my astonishment, I found living descendants for 8 of the 27 names, grandchildren and great-grandchildren now scattered across Israel, the United States, and Europe. After careful consideration, I reached out to each of them, explaining who I was and what I had discovered. Their responses varied, some wanted nothing to do with me, others were cautiously curious, and a few saw it as an opportunity for a different kind of reconciliation. Miriam Cohen, a professor in Tel Aviv whose grandmother appeared on the list, wrote, "History connects us through a terrible thread. But perhaps in acknowledging this connection, we create something new from it." With the help of Dr. Bauer's committee, I established a foundation funded by the recovered assets. Its purpose was twofold: to support Holocaust education and to create dialogue between descendants of survivors and perpetrators. The foundation would be governed by a board comprising descendants from both sides of that terrible history. In September of that year, I found myself in Berlin, sitting around a conference table with 11 other people, each of us carrying histories we had inherited rather than lived. Some had lost entire branches of their family trees to the Holocaust. I represented the branch that had helped cause that loss. "Why do this?" asked David Rosenthal, whose grandfather had survived Dachau. "Why not just donate the money and be done with it?" "Because money alone doesn't address the legacy," I answered honestly. My grandfather lived a double life, the man who committed horrible acts and the man who tried to atone for them. I've inherited that complexity. Simply writing a check feels like avoiding the harder work. "And what is that work?" asked Sarah Bergman, whose family had fled Germany in 1938. I considered her question carefully. "I think it's learning to live with uncomfortable truths without seeking easy resolution. It's acknowledging harm without expecting forgiveness. It's creating something meaningful from terrible history without trying to rewrite it." Over the next 3 days, we crafted a mission and structure for the foundation. We argued, sometimes heatedly, about priorities and approaches. We shared stories of how our families' histories had shaped us. And gradually, something remarkable emerged, not friendship exactly, but a shared commitment to facing history honestly while creating new possibilities from its aftermath. The Heinemann Dachau Dialogue Foundation launched the following spring. Its first initiative funded oral history projects capturing the stories of the last living survivors. Its second created exchange programs between German and Israeli students. And perhaps most meaningfully, it established an annual dialogue between descendants of Holocaust perpetrators and survivors, a space for the difficult conversations most people avoid. When I returned to Oregon after the Foundation's inaugural event, I found myself thinking about the wooden bird carving that still sat on my mantel. I examined it again, wondering what my grandfather had meant by his tiny carved message, reminder, both truths matter. Perhaps he meant that he was both the man who had committed atrocities and the man who had tried to atone for them. Perhaps he meant that justice and mercy both have claims on us. Or perhaps he meant something more fundamental, that in confronting the darkest chapters of human history, we must resist the temptation to simplify complex moral reckonings into comfortable narratives. Whatever he meant, I had come to my own understanding of living with difficult truths. The Foundation's work didn't erase my grandfather's crimes or absolve me from the complications of his legacy. Instead, it acknowledged them while creating something constructive from their aftermath, not redemption, exactly, but perhaps a different kind of reckoning. Last week, I received an email from Esther Goldstein, a high school student in Chicago whose great-grandmother had been on my grandfather's list. She had participated in one of the Foundation's dialogue programs. "I always thought about Holocaust history as something frozen in the past," she wrote. "But meeting you and the others showed me how it continues to ripple through generations. I'm still processing what it means that the man whose grandfather helped murder my great-grandmother's family is now funding my college scholarship. But I think there's something important in facing these contradictions rather than hiding from them." Her words captured exactly what I had come to believe, that there is value in confronting difficult truths without demanding neat resolutions. The safe in my grandfather's basement had contained more than secrets and tainted money, it had contained questions about justice, memory, responsibility, and redemption that had no simple answers. As I write these words, sitting in my Oregon home with mountains visible through the window, I am neither absolved of my grandfather's legacy nor defined solely by it. I have made my choices as he made his, though mine came from a place of inherited responsibility rather than direct guilt. The safe is empty now, but the questions it contained continue to shape my life, and, through the Foundation's work, the lives of others connected by history's complicated threads. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.